I've gone to church all my life, and I've heard many people talk and give sermons, and that was a story I heard about a pastor was giving a sermon one Sunday morning, and it was apparently a long, boring sermon. He noticed while he was giving the sermon, a man got up and walked out. He was a little puzzled by that, and afterward, the people were having coffee and visiting. He went up to this man and introduced himself, welcomed him, and he said, "I noticed you got up and walked out during the sermon. Is there something wrong?" The man said, "No, it's nothing really wrong." He said, "But I had to go and get a haircut." And the preacher said, "A haircut? Why did you get a haircut before the service started?" "Because," he said, "I didn't need one then." Long and boring, right? I want to talk with you today about listening. That marvelous story we just heard read, thank you for reading that great story about I call them the M&M sisters, Martha and Mary. And we can learn so much from that story just by reading it and thinking about it, but also I think we can learn some things by kind of reading between the lines. Importance of listening. If I could talk to Mary and Martha, I would say the same thing to them as I would say to myself and to every one of us. Listen. Listen to Jesus. Listen up and live. We can learn so much by listening to what he has to teach us. I was looking in the Bible earlier this week, and I looked up the places, some places where Jesus told people to listen to him. Matthew 13:3, Jesus told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen." Matthew 13:9, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." Matthew 15:10, Jesus called a crowd to him and said to him, "Listen and understand." Luke 8:18, Jesus speaking to his disciples says, "Then pay attention to how you listen." Listen up and live. I found this, I haven't thought about this verse in a long time, from John 6:63. Jesus says, "The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life." Isn't that marvelous? What Jesus had to say, they're not just empty words, not just some more information, but he says, "My words are spirit and life." And isn't that what we all need and we all want? Spirit and life. We need to hear Jesus teach us about God's purpose and design for life. We need to listen to Jesus because he'll teach us important truths about relationships and about conduct. We need to listen to Jesus because he will help us navigate our way through the perplexities and ambiguities of life. We listen to Jesus, he will give us information and inspiration to help us make wise choices that will enhance life. His words are spirit and they are life. So we need to listen up and live. In the Bible, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we have what's typically called a Sermon on the Mount. It's a lengthy teaching of Jesus. And it says here that the people gathered around him and he began to teach them. When we come to the end of his teaching, he says, "Those who hear my word and act on them are wise. Those who hear my words and do not act on them are foolish." And then he tells a story. If you don't mind, I'd like to embellish it a little bit. Troy, the two men who built houses. Now, we don't know a lot about that's 2,000 years ago. We were not about the customs and the laws and the regulations, but it's interesting, you know, the land where Jesus lived, the terrain and the climate is somewhat similar to New Mexico. But here are the two men, they decided they would build houses for themselves and their families. And the one man chose an area a little bit of a higher elevation than land around him. And he was digging down in the sand and digging and digging and digging, because he knew that sometimes the weather can be kind of threatening. It's best to dig down deep and somehow anchor the house on rock, have a rock foundation down in there. So he was busy working and gathering his building supplies, and he went down to Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever to get building supplies so he could build a nice house, a secure house. Another man came along. He was kind of new to the area, wasn't all that familiar with the surroundings, and he observed this man, what he was doing. He said, I'm going to build a house too. But he said, that looks like an awful lot of work. You know, you're working so hard and long and digging down there. Is that really necessary? The other guy said, well, yeah, you know, it's important to anchor your house because there can be some bad storms sometimes. But this guy thought, well, that's a lot of hard work. He went down a little lower elevation and there was a lot of sand. It's simple. Just spread out the sand, smooth it out. He went to work and built his house right there. And there was a long dry spell like we're having now here. You know, having blue skies and no rain, and so they worked hard, both of them, and they finished their houses, and they're both so proud of what they had done. And one evening they were standing outside talking to each other and congratulating themselves and each other all good job they'd done building their houses and how happy their families were. And they were standing there talking. It was a nice cool evening and the sun had set. One said to the other, you notice what's happening over there in the horizon? Looked like clouds. And they stood there watching, and sure enough, coming rapidly, clouds moving in. Before long, the wind was picking up, blowing dust around. And as they stood and watched, the clouds kind of billowing in darker and more threatening. And the wind was picking up and blowing harder. And they both ran to their houses to keep dry and spend time with their families. But the cloud rolled in, dark and threatening, and the rain was coming down harder and harder and harder, coming down in torrents. And guess what happened? Well, Jesus summarized it like this. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts of them are like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew, beat against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. Listen, says Jesus. Listen up. My words are spirit and life. It's what we all need and want. In the newspaper this past week, there was an article written by Leonard Pitts, and I read this article. I thought, wow, this speaks to me. Pitts writes about the rampant violence going on all around us, so much in the news. He calls it madness. Toward the end of the article, he writes about remarks that was made by Robert Kennedy right after Martin Luther King had been killed. Kennedy was in Indianapolis talking to a crowd, and he was informed that King had been killed. So he then decided he would tell the audience what had happened. And Pitts, in writing the article this past week, quotes Robert Kennedy. He says, "What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need is not violence and lawlessness. What we need is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer in our country." And then Pitts concludes his article with this: "Those words feel hopelessly idealistic, impossibly innocent, and yet wise, grace-filled, and right for the raw pain of this moment, and I commend them to all our wounded spirits." And I read that and I thought, I suspect a lot of people have similar thoughts about the teachings of Jesus. Hopelessly idealistic, not applicable and relevant to modern life. I believe, however, that the grace-filled words of Jesus are just what we all need at any moment in our lives. And we need to listen up and listen. Let's go back to the story about Mary and Martha. I love that story. I've always liked that story. And here are these sisters, and probably quite different in many respects in terms of temperament and in terms of thinking processes and lifestyle. That's not uncommon among siblings. Many of us here know that from our own lives. But here are these two sisters, Mary and Martha. I like to believe they are both good people, and both have a lot to offer. Martha, for example, is very hospitable. She welcomed Jesus into their home. Don't you like to be around hospitable people? People who are welcoming and thoughtful and caring. And Jesus, no doubt, had been traveling and probably was tired and maybe hungry and thirsty. And he appears at the doorstep, and Martha welcomes him in. And Martha was sensitive. She was going to fix something to eat. And she was caring, a very caring, hospitable person. And this visit came unexpectedly, and there were no convenience stores around and no supermarkets nearby. So what did she do? Maybe she had to bake some biscuits and fix some coffee. Well, not coffee, but maybe squeeze some grapes and get some grape juice. She was a hospitable person, a very caring person. Mary probably was a very different temperament, maybe more quiet and laid back. And it says in the story how Mary sat at his feet listening. I wonder if Martha maybe was inflicted with the CDTs. You know what the CDTs are? Cares, difficulties, and troubles. We're all like Martha, aren't we? At different times in life. We all have the CDTs. We have a lot of cares, a lot of difficulties, a lot of troubles in life. And I can picture Martha being in the presence of Jesus. I can picture Jesus being sympathetic. Really, sympathetic toward her, understanding how hard life can be at times. And why was she so anxious and troubled? We don't really know, but apparently she was, and I'm sure Jesus was sensitive to her. And you read between the lines, maybe he offered her some compliments and thanked her for serving him and caring. But he also told Martha, I care about you. And maybe you should set aside some of your busyness for a few moments and come and join your sister, Mary, and sit at my feet and listen to what I have to say. I'd like to believe Jesus would say the same thing to all of us. In the midst of our CDTs, all the cares and difficulties and troubles of life, and we are anxious and troubled about many things like Martha was, we can hear the word of Jesus, come. Come and sit at my feet and learn from me. So here's Mary sitting at his feet. I would have loved to have been nearby and listened in on that conversation. Don't you wonder what Jesus said to her? But think for a moment. What would it be like for you to sit at the feet of Jesus, all alone with him, just the two of you? What would you say to him? What would you ask him? I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask. What do you think he'd say to you? Would he tell you about all the failures and mistakes you've made in your life? Would he remind you of all the bad choices you have made? Would he tell you that you could have done much better here and much better there, just gone over all your mistakes in life? I don't think so. I think you already know that. He wouldn't have to tell you that. I think he would look you in the eye and he would tell you what a precious person you are, how much he cares about you. And his words would be like spirit and life to you. He would call attention to all your possibilities, and all the potentials you yet have in your life. He would somehow enable you to set aside some of your CDTs, your cares and difficulties and trouble, and he would give you a new sense of peace in your heart and mind, and a new conviction that you can go forward in life and you can trust in Jesus and be his faithful follower. So listen up, and live. I'd like to invite you all to close your eyes for just a moment. Would you welcome Jesus into your mind and your heart? And listen to him as he welcomes you and equips you so you can trust him and follow him. Lord, I thank you for every person here today and how much you love and care for each one of us. In your precious name, amen.
Amen.